Hi, welcome back. This is Evan, and this is part 5 of Universidad Francisco Marroquin's series on book repair. Today we're going to do a recase, and I'm going to show you the problems that we're going to work on today. This is when the hinges of a book are failing, but the case is okay. Paper knife, micro spatula, lifting knife, bone folder of Teflon, and also a bone folder of bone. Scissors, a scalpel with a metal straight edge, which can be a ruler, spring dividers, an awl, needles, and thread, and finally 2 brushes, one for PVA and one for methylcellulose. 2 double folio end sheets for each book you'll repair, a Western paper lining, Japanese paper, a textile lining, 2 boards, heavyweight paper, and book cloth. It will also be useful to have some newsprint on hand as waste paper, and that should be all you need. This first one is an example where the first hinge is okay, but the second is completely detached. And I have another example which we'll work on where both hinges are completely detached here, like this and like that. So the way we're going to fix them is by separating the text from the case. So it makes 2 parts, basically the text and the case. And we're going to consolidate the text, reform the case or repair it a little bit, and then put them back together again. So the first way we're going to do that is you need to separate the end papers. You need to break the hinge if there's still any remaining left. So what I'm going to do is try and separate it by pressure. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to use a scalpel and just cut it. And this is kind of hard. I think this is a synthetic glue. So I'm going to take a scalpel and a straight edge and simply separate them without trying to cut the cloth. I don't want to cut the cloth because it gives me the option to reuse my case covers if the case is in good shape. And if the case is in good shape and you want to reuse it, sometimes it's easier to reuse the case instead of making a new one. But other times, if the case is in bad shape, you want to remake the case in any event. So this case is in pretty good shape, and I might reuse this. I probably would reuse this if I was going to, or in the middle of this process, and you'll see. So I separated the text from the case. Next, I want to reconsolidate the text block by taking off the old adhesive, which clearly didn't work over here. And I can tell right now that this is a synthetic glue. I think it's going to be quite hard to take off. So that's why I wanted to choose another example here, which I think is a natural glue, an animal glue, which in book repair you'll see quite often. So I'm going to go through both examples here. I'm going to use working boards to protect the case blocks when I put it in the lying press to my right. And then you'll see how you can take off the existing layers of glue, and you can see the paper here also. We're going to take it all off. So I'm using the lying press. This is actually called a casing press, and you can use it as a vertical press, or in this case as a horizontal press, so it gives you a little more versatility. So first I'm going to try to take off the paper with a flat edge, such as with a paper knife or with a micro spatula. And then after that, I'm going to put on some animal glue. Comes off very easily with moisture. So methylcellulose or a wheat starch paste or a corn paste will work very well also. If there's end bands, you'd like to keep the end bands because we're going to reapply them. And you can see here's one end band, and it's already coming off. So I'm going to, when I get to that level, when I get to the past the craft paper, I'm going to take it off, put it aside, and then reattach it when I rebuild the layers on the linings on the spine. There's that first end band. Now this glue under here, it's animal glue. You can tell by its smell. It smells, I don't know how to describe it, but it's got its own unique smell. And especially when it gets wet, you'll be able to, with experience, identify it pretty quick. All right, that's good enough for now. What I'm going to do now is put on a poultice, which will really just hold moisture on it so it can penetrate the hide glue, the animal glue, and loosen it up where I can just scrape it off much easier. And so I have some methylcellulose prepared here. I think it's about 2.5 by weight, 2.5% by weight. But we don't really use paste down here, so you can use paste as well, but both will be fine. I'm just going to put it on and let it sit. I'm just going to glop it on and let it sit for a while, probably about, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes, then reapply another layer, and then see if I can scrape anything off. Now the other text block is synthetic. It's from I think the 60s or 70s, 1960s or 70s, when synthetic glues were much more common. And synthetic glues can be really difficult to take off. So reconsolidating the text block with synthetic adhesive can be really tough. I mean, if you can't take off the glue, you're not going to be able to reconsolidate the text blocks. You can't be able to get into the signatures and re-tip them together. So we'll see that example in a minute, but this hide glue should be coming off pretty quick. So I'm just going to let this wait for a minute so the moisture can get into the glue. And the goal of this is to, when I use the new glue, I want to tip the end of the signatures back together. So I want to get as much as I can off of the original. It looked like the moisture penetrated pretty well. Everything's a lot easier to take off now, as you can see. Might need another treatment of moisture here, but let me just take off what I can at this point. And it'll be useful to put what you pull off on some waste paper or some board or anything you really like to get it away from your text block would be fine. And this glue is brittle. That's pretty characteristic of animal glue. You can see it's when I drag my knife across it. You can actually hear the sound also, but it's very brittle, and that's why moisture works really, really well in this case, because it really softens that brittleness. Heat you can also use. Heat will soften it a little bit, but if you do use heat, just make sure that you don't burn your text block. I guess you could say the same about moisture. If you use moisture, you don't want too much moisture to seep into your sections. But I like moisture because you do have a bit more control. So I'm going to reapply because after I got that first layer of paper off, the glue underneath is still pretty dry, still pretty brittle. So I'm just going to glop it on again, let it sit for a while, and then go at it again. Now the steps I'm doing now, and what I will be doing with regard to the text block, are pretty typical of case bindings. So case bindings are began in about the 1820s, and really took off. It's the form that books are produced today. Even it's where the text block is produced separately from the case, and then they're all put together in a separate process. And because they are separate processes, the text block is its own unique animal, and then the case is its own unique animal. So they can both be treated separately before you put them back together again. So I think I'm just going to leave this dry, or let this dry right now. Usually you'd probably want to let this dry a little bit more. Let the moisture seep in a little bit more. But for the purposes of this video, we'll see what we can get off here, and then we'll move on to lining the spine, which would be the same in both cases, in the natural glue and also the synthetic glue case. I think this end band is ready to come off. When I lifted this end band here, it looked like a lot of the glue came up without a doubt, which is good, but it also looked like that the backs of the sections, the paper parts, also came up, and that would be bad. Bad examples of that, if the cases are bad, you would have to re-guard your sections and then re-sew them all together. it's basically separating the sheets of your book. So I don't want to do that. I just want this bit. I just want the end band and the glue and this mull, which is a mesh-like material, which is used to combine the text block with your case. Okay, that came off pretty well. I'm using a bit of pressure, but I'm not using too much pressure because I certainly, like I said about when pulling off the end band, I definitely don't want to harm the paper. I don't want to harm the sections, which are at this point pretty moist from all the methyl cell that I just put on. So you want to be pretty careful not to ruin the spine of your book. And you can see now how everything's coming up pretty well. I think this is almost there. I think I'm going to do one more reapplication, and hopefully I can quickly take off that last layer of glue. And the glue is brown. Another characteristic of animal glue is it'll be yellow or brown or pretty dark neutral color. This spine is in pretty good shape though. It's still hard. It's still very compact. So yeah, I'm going to put one last layer on quickly, and let's see how much we can get off. And you can see how I'm not putting any of the methylcellulose or the moisture on this part here because the glue already came off. If I did that, I'd just be moistening the backs of the paper and weakening that when I run my knife over it. So I'm staying away from there as much as I can. You can see these end papers. You want to make sure not to lose these also, because when you put them back, you want to make sure you have them around. So I'm going to put them on top of the linings that I'll be putting on later. Okay, find my knife here and see what I can get off here. There, it's coming a bit. It's still a bit brittle. I probably should have left this quite a bit longer, but for the purposes of this video, you can get the idea. It'll almost be white, the spine. It'll be as if it's fresh paper. For example, in that section right there and that section there, they look pretty white. All right. Now, I didn't get as much off as I wanted to, or as you should when you try this. But the idea is exactly the same. You want to take off as much of the original glue as you can without harming the paper folds of your spine. So I'm going to take this out and continue with the other book and build my linings up. I could build my linings up on this, and if I did, it would be in the exact same way that I'll be doing on the other. So I just used this example so you could see how to take off the original glue. Getting back to this first text block, I'm going to try and peel off the layers. And I cheated a little bit. We tried using moisture on this spine and also a little bit of heat, and nothing really worked to get the glue off. So the goal here is going to be to get this lining of craft paper off, and basically as much as we can, and then we'll rebuild the case to make it ready to get. Then we'll rebuild the text block to make it ready to put into the case. And I'm going to use my micro spatula. Okay. So you want to get all that off, but in this example, it's going to take a little bit more time. So I'm just going to move on. And what I'm going to do is reline the spine, but put new end papers on, and then reinforce the end papers by sewing through the synthetic adhesive. The way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to tip on some new end papers, which we made previously. They're just double folio and a little heavier weight than the text. And I'm going to tip them on with PVA. You can use any acid-free adhesive. There's different kinds of PVA out there. They'll all be fine. You just want to make sure it's acid-free and conservation work. So I'm putting a little line, a little bead of adhesive on the edge. The end paper I'm using right now is a little bit oversized, and that's not a problem. That's on purpose because it's much easier to trim an end paper after it's on than it is before. So basically the overhanging parts I'll trim near the end of the process, and that's no problem. I'm going to do the same for the other side after I bone it down. And I'm making one end perfectly square, this end here, and the other end is the one that's a little bit oversized, as you can see. The danger when you're working with PVA is putting too much on and basically making a mess. Or that's one of the dangers, I should say. It's really easy to just put too much on and adhere the pages of your text block together. And that's obviously a bad thing to do, but it'll also make your book just not look as nice. So less is more with PVA a lot of the times. Okay, and I'm going to attach the other end paper. So the corner that will be flush is going to be on one side flush and on the other oversized. Okay. That'll just make it easier to trim. What I need to do is to attach the end papers to the book a bit more strongly. So what I'm going to do is sew them through the spine, and that will really strengthen the bond between the end papers and the text block. And because the end papers, as well as the linings, are what connect the text to the case, it's very important that they're pretty strong. So it's okay also to tip them on if you like, but I prefer to sew them as well. And what I'm going to do is use my needle and thread and put it together like a pamphlet. Just going to do a pamphlet stitch. I'm going to need a little bit of thread here. About 3 times the height of your book is a rule of thumb, I think. So something like that should do. I'm going to thread my needle. And before I sew, I'm going to poke holes. Make some holes inside the where I'm going to make some holes where I'm going to sew, so that'll make my job a bit easier. Also, I actually need to sew this because this is a double folio, so these 2 folios are not really attached to each other, so they need some more strength. So the way to thread this needle is to just put it through the hole, and then you want to unwind the end of your thread just a tiny bit so your point can go through it. And after it's, oops, I missed it. So after I go through, and it's kind of hard to do, but after I go through, I'm going to pull it down, pull it together. This might be hard to see, but you're going to need to learn it. So you pull it down, pull it through, and pull until you can hear a snap. And that's called, I guess, locking it in. So now I'm going to sew this. But like I said, I'm going to first make my holes, my guide holes, using a pretty sharp awl. So the way I'm going to do that, the holes can be somewhat arbitrary because you're putting on something completely new onto the book. You could use the same channels that the book was originally sewn in for continuity, and that's probably recommended, but It's hard to see these, the original channels here with all that synthetic glue on there. So they're going to be pretty arbitrary. And I'm going to make, let's see, 3 or 5 is usually the norm. I think I'm just going to make 3, but feel free to use any number and any style that you like. Just going to make sure these are pretty tight. Okay. There's one. There's one in the middle. Here's another at the end. Oh. Another at the end right there. Okay, and then I'm just going to split these two with 2 more there. I might as well do the other side before I start sewing. And you want to try and actually get through some of the adhesive, if it's possible, that is still on there. It'll actually, that synthetic glue is really super strong, and it'll be here for a long time. So getting through there will just attach your end papers to your text block with a little bit more strength. Way to do a pamphlet stitch now. So go in through the outside. Go in through the outside. Go to the one adjacent. Go through the hole that's adjacent to the origin, or the first hole that I used. And go out. Pull it a little bit tight. Then continue to the last hole. Come back in through the second hole I went into. I'll pull it a bit tight. I'm going to skip the first hole, or the origin, and then go in at this hole, out through the last hole, pull it a bit tight, in through this hole, and finally out through the same hole that I started with. And so now what I have is 2 threads that I'm just going to tie into a knot after I pull it tight. And then that'll just reinforce what you have. Another way to work is to make holes also in the first section of your book, and then make a link stitch to both of the end papers as well as the first section of your book. So that gives you added strength. You can also not overcast, but or oversew, but you can also there are other ways to add extra strength, and they'd all be fine. So I made a square knot. I made a square knot here, and that should hold fine. So I'm going to do the same on the other side. Get it right this time, first time. And then after that, we'll be ready to add layers of linings, as well as what's going to attach the text to the case, which is, in this case, we're going to use what's called crash or mull, super. Cambric can be used. A textile lining is a pretty general way to call it. In through the first hole in the middle, out through one adjacent to it. It can be this hole or it can be that hole. The pattern isn't going to change. The pattern is going to stay the same. I'm ready to put it in the lying press or casing press over here. I trim so there's about 4 millimeters of overhanging thread. You don't want too little, or else if the knot frays a bit, it can completely come apart. But you don't want too much, because it'll be on your spine and might stick out a bit. So I'm going to put this back in boards and then bring it over to the press. Now, if this were a book with the animal glue, like in the first example, this spine would be should be completely white, and with the backs of the original sections still, or you'll be able to get at the original backs of the sections. So since I can't, and since I'm just using the synthetic adhesive as the first base, I'm just going to build on top of that adhesive. So I'm just making this a little flatter. But what I'm going to do is put a reversible layer of long fiber tissue or Japanese tissue onto it, and then we'll build from there. I'm going to be using PVA, but what's more common is to use a paste, again, a wheat starch paste or a different type of paste, because that's sometimes a little reversible. In the climate down here, it's very almost tropical, so there's a lot of insects, and insects love paste. So we're not going to use paste, but feel free, and it's probably a little more common if you're in the United States, I think. So I'm going to use PVA. I have the long fiber tissue ready to go. You'll see it's a little bit oversized. It's quite big for it, and that'll be fine. I'm just going to paste up. I'm going to glue up the spine, put the Japanese tissue down, and then after it dries, I'm going to cut around it. I'm just trying to get the spine. If I get any onto the end papers, so if I get any glue that comes over, that's really not too big a problem, but you want to keep that to a minimum to make the best repair you can. Long fiber tissue is so, fibrous, that I don't want to bone it down with my bone folder too much, or else the paper will come down, and I don't want to really hammer it in there. What I want to do is instead kind of just press it down and let the glue do the work. When I put the glue on, if I was doing this on a book where I could get at the spines and tip the sections together, I'd really want to work in the glue so that I could tip together the sections. But in this case, with the synthetic adhesive as the first layer that I'll be building on, really, it's not that big a deal. So I just patted it down, and now I'm just going to use a somewhat hard brush to just pat it down a bit more. And I use the brush because the Japanese tissue, as I mentioned, it likes to come off. It likes to almost get fuzzy. The fibers like to break apart if you really try to work it too hard. So this is a nice way to softly put the paper to the glue. The nice thing about PVA is it'll dry pretty quick. If you're using paste, you'd want to let this dry overnight, or you can kind of cheat and use a hair dryer to dry it a little quicker. But this will dry in less than 10 minutes. Well, it'll dry in 10 minutes. I think for the purposes of this video, we'll go a little sooner than we might otherwise. But in general, you really want to make sure this is dry because it's such an integral layer to your restoration. Okay, so that's our first layer. But still, we have nothing to attach the text to the case. So what we'll be doing is using what's called the textile lining, which can be cambric or mesh or mull. In this case, we use a mesh. That's pretty good. So what I'm just going to do is glue up the... first I need to size this. So I need to make sure that this is the right size, and this turns out this is actually a little small. But you would like this so that it comes out maybe 2 millimeters from both the head and the tail. So basically, almost the entirety of the spine you'd like to be covered with the crash or the mull or the lining. So you want it to be overhanging. Actually, you want it to be overhanging the spine, because this is the part. This is the first part that's going to be attached to the case when we put it back together. So it's actually going to be. This is going to stay. We're not going to trim this like we did for the Japanese paper. So I'm going to put this down with some PVA again. And if you were using, if you had a book that was with an animal glue, you would be using PVA in this case as well. So paste for the first lining if you have a book with animal glue, but in the second linings and more, PVA. Directly after I put this on, I'd like to put on a lining of Western paper, a shorter fibered paper, because that will, the more linings you have, the less your book wants to open. And so it's a balance deciding how many linings you'd like to put on. A rule of thumb is just to put one lining of Western paper on after your textile lining, but with experience you'll be able to vary how many linings you'd like to put on depending on the weight of the book, its fragility, and a number of other factors. Okay, so I'm going to put this on by stretching it over, putting some more glue on, so the glue really works in between the holes of the mesh or the textile and really adheres itself to each other as well as the linings of the spine. And then after this, I'm going to use my bone folder to impress the glue in between those holes and with the spine also. I mean, the goal of using a textile lining is its strength rather than paper. It's stronger, and the mesh factor of it, the fact it has holes, really increases its strength because it allows more glue per, I guess, square inch or per any unit of distance. It allows more glue to adhere. So I'm using a bit of pressure here and working it in a bit, wiping off any excess off my bone folder, trying to define the edge a bit as well. What's very important, I should emphasize, is the edge of your book, or the edge of your spine. If the textile lining isn't adhered to the edge of your spine, it's going to peel off, and since it's really so integral to the text-to-case connection, when that peels off, your book will probably need another conservation treatment eventually. I have a Western paper lining that I'm going to put on top of it. So I have my piece. Let me just make sure that it'll fit. So I'm going to put some fresh PVA on the spine and then put this down. That will be the last lining that we do for the recase procedure. I guess the text is almost ready to go. We still have to trim those end papers, but structurally, it's basically there. Now, if you have end bands, and this book didn't, but the first book we did, if you have end bands, this is the time to put them on. So you'd put them on at the top and the bottom. You can also glue out your lining, and that's probably a little more common because this is going to expand a bit more than the material on my spine will. But this will work too. And this should fit nicely over. And I'm going to press down and then bone it down. If there weren't adhesive here, the synthetic adhesive that we started from, you should bone it down enough where you can actually almost see the sections again. In this case, though, like I said about that synthetic adhesive, that's kind of obscuring everything. But I think it's important to include in this video because most books nowadays are all use synthetic adhesives, so you should get used to them in your library or institution. So this is good. I'm going to let this dry and turn my attention towards preparing the covers again. So there's two ways to recase a book. You can use the existing covers or you can use new covers. So I have two examples here, and what we can do is look at them and see what we'd like to do. This is an example of a book that I think new covers would be nice, but they might not be necessary. This is a strong case. You'd want to keep your case, especially if there is historic material or artifactual value in the covers of the book or the end papers of the book. But I should like to mention that a recase in this way that I've been teaching is for general collections only, and special collections have a whole different set of considerations. So in this instance, I'm going to try and reuse the covers. And the way I'm going to do that is by lifting the original paste downs and using what's left, using the board and the cloth, and not separating the covers from the spine piece. I'm going to start lifting this one because I'm going to reuse it. I'm going to lift the paste downs, starting at the edges, and you just want to find a place where you can start lifting with this one. Looks good. It was rucking up a little bit already. And that's how you want to start. Sometimes you can even dig in under the paste down a little bit into the cloth, and that'll give you an opportunity to lift a little bit of the board too, and that'll be fine. Because keep in mind, we'll be taking this off. So the cleaner you can get it off, the better, the less you'll be able to see under, but structurally, it'll be fine either way. So this was a book we prepared previously that it's the front hinge was fine, the back hinge was a problem. So what we did was took off the cover, prepared the text block like we just did with the end papers, the textile lining, and then the Western paper lining. And this one had headbands, which we put on also. And as you can see, the end papers here are still oversized. So we're going to trim those in a second. But getting back to the cover, I lifted this already, and that came off, as far as it goes, this came off well. I wouldn't have liked to take this part off, but oftentimes when you're doing this procedure, the cloth can be a bit tricky. So whatever will work structurally will be fine for your collection. I did leave a little bit here though, so I can show you. I'm going to take my lifting knife, which is a very slight bevel, but pretty sharp, and continue working this. So I worked in from the corners, and this came up pretty easily, this example. So I'm going to work in from the corners, and you want to be a bit delicate because you don't really want to rip. You want to get this off in one piece if you can. This one came off really easily. A little bit of board, which would be fine. And now basically we have a case, original case, ready for a text block and new paste downs. So in the example that we pre-made, all I need to do here is trim these end papers and then recase it like I would as if I'm making a new book. So let's do that. And after we do this book, I have another pre-made example where we are going to remake the case. So basically make a new case and then put it back in, put a new text block into it. So I'm using a cutting mat. I'm going to trim by putting a straight edge just over that end paper and just at the edge of the text block. I want to make sure, obviously, not to cut much of the text block, or any of the text block, but I also don't want the end papers to overhang. And then I'm going to do this side over here. Same for the other side. So basically, I'm ready to case this in. But before I do so, there's another example that I'd like to show where if you're going to restore a text block and you want to make a new case, I can show you how to do that now. And I have a pre-made example. Let me tidy up here a little bit. Where the materials are already pre-cut. So what I'll be doing is putting together this book, which has a cover that has very little information that we care about. There's a bunch of tape on it, electrical tape and masking tape. And so I took it apart. It was already coming apart. And this is the case we don't want to use again. So we take it off. We can prepare to throw it out. And the text block is basically ready to go as well. So what we need to do is make a new case. So I have some pre-cut materials here that I'm going to make into a case. The boards are pre-sanded on the front and cut to size. The cloth is oversized, and that's fine. We're going to trim it after. Glue out the first board, put it down, and then line up the other pieces so that I have a square case, and it stands up straight on the shelf. So I'm just going to start with this first piece. I'm going to glue it out with PVA or PVA methylcellulose mix or any adhesive you like that is neutral or is in common use in conservation. This is just straight PVA. We're not using binder's board or Davy board, but a little bit of a thinner board. It's not only more common down here in Guatemala, but it is also more appropriate to the size of the book I'm working on. I don't really need really thick boards for a book that, for example, might be pretty thin. It'll be not only out of place, but if the book isn't sitting comfortably between its covers, that could lead to some problems down the line. So I'm gluing this out. The edges are pretty important because you don't want those peeling up, so I'm just going over those again. And I should mention that you want everything with the grain vertical to the spine. Everything such as cloth or paper or the board that I'm using. So everything is basically more in line with each other. And when moisture attacks the book, things expand in tandem and contract in tandem. Now I'm going to bone this down after lining it up. And I have my Teflon folder here. I'm giving it a bit of pressure. What's most important is that the glue spreads out evenly. Next, I'm going to make a mark between the board and what's going to be the spine piece of this case, about 5 millimeters away from that board. This is going to be the groove that separates the spine, the curve of the spine, and the start of the board. And a good rule of thumb, each book is going to have its own size of its shoulder. But a good rule of thumb is anywhere from 4 to 7 millimeters will be fine, or is where it's usually going to be. So I'm going to make my mark there. And I make my mark with my dividers strong enough so that I can see it, but not strong enough so that it makes a giant hole in the cloth that you'll be able to see when everything is done. So I'm just going to glue this out, put it down, and then do the other one, do the other board. So this long straight edge here is going to be really useful to make my in making my board straight and making my case square. So I want to line up the top of my spine piece with the square edge, with this square straight edge, so that I have an even space in the groove, an even groove here. Now I'm going to bone it down. And I'm going to do the last piece. You want to fold up any of your used newsprint or any of your used waste paper that you use, because having a tidy shop will, everything's going to be a lot cleaner if you have a tidy shop. So again, I'm going to line up straight edge with the first board I put down. I'm going to make my mark the same distance that the first groove is, the first space is, and then I'm going to put this down. Okay, so I'm going to put it down. Get that bond well. And to emphasize the bond, to really make sure that the bond is even and strong, I'm going to put it in between boards and give it a press in this big press we have behind me. So when you take these boards, I'm going to cover the cloth, with newsprint so it doesn't get dirty from the boards. And then I'm going to just put it in. So I'm putting this in between boards, going to nip it in the press, and I'm going to try and put the boards directly under the screw. So you want to center up your boards as best you can, so the pressure really is even. So I'm going to put it down now. And it doesn't need to be too hard, just some pressure. Again, the idea here is just to spread out the glue evenly across the entire board so it adheres strongly to the cloth. So you want that for about anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes would be fine. So for the purposes of this example, I'm going to take it out. So I took the case out of the press, and I forgot to mention that you'd like to put a spine piece over your spine so that the platen is pressing down evenly across the whole of your case, not just on the parts with the board. But anyway, so now I took the case out, and I'm ready to trim it and prepare it so it's just like the original covers that we made in the first part. These over here that I'm going to pull out, these ones that we prepared, it's going to look basically like this. So the way I'm going to get even turn-ins here, I'm going to use my spring dividers and mark them to about 5/8 of an inch or about 2 centimeters all around. This is variable. You can use any different width. Whatever you prefer, whatever looks best, will be fine. Again, this is just basically an aesthetic decision about how big you'd like your turn-ins. So if you can see, I made marks from the edges of my board, one here, and I'm going to trim that. I'm going to connect those by using my blade and trimming that off. I'm doing the same over here on this end, one mark over here and one mark over here, and I'm I'm pushing my divider up against the board so it's even. So basically you'll see this is like a line that I'm going to cut right there. And see, that's my last mark, and that was my first mark. So basically, you don't need to make lines if you don't want to, and I typically don't. I find it's much easier and faster just to make marks where you need them instead of using your pencil to make an infinite number of marks. So, made that mark there, I'm going to make, and I'm going to continue making these marks all around, and then I'm going to cut where I made those marks. So there, and there. Here, and here. Having a sharp blade when you cut cloth is important because if your blade isn't sharp, you're going to, the fibers in the cloth are going to not realign, but they are going to be somewhat wobbly and be able to come out, and you can pick them off. So it's best to have a sharp blade that wherein you won't have any loose fibers coming out. And you'll have clean, nice cuts. Now you see the way I'm moving the case around is just a habit that I like. Basically doing the same motion here with my left hand holding the ruler or the straight edge, my right hand cutting. And what's moving is the case. It's not me. The way I'm cutting is going to be the same. And the more you're able to develop habits that you like and you like to do, the more you'll be able to move a little faster. If you're going to do a lot of recases, if you're going to do recases on in batches, you'd like to have pre-cut materials, pre-cut boards, and pre-cut spine strips, as well as pre-cut linings that we used in the first half when we consolidated the text. Having strips pre-cut is making your work going to go a lot faster also. So it would be a good idea if you're doing the work in bulk to have some pre-cut strips of all the materials that we use today, so you can use it for any size of book that might come into your shop. Okay, so getting back to the case, it's almost there. We've got a nice window here that we're going to put aside. And so we have a case with equal edges, and what we want to do now is turn it in, make turn-ins, so the case looks very much like these, or actually more like this one. So we're just going to glue it up, but before we do, I'm just going to emphasize the folds. And that'll just make it fold easier when it's glued up. Now this cloth is it's very thin cloth. I don't think it's starch backed, but it's backed with something, and I'm not really sure what it is. You're free to use any type of cloth, buckram. I guess you could use paper if you like, but you want something that's neutral and that's backed with a neutral material and that'll last on your shelves. I think this cloth also tends to show through on the front a bit. So if you have a cloth like that, you'd like the way you put your glue onto your boards, it'll show. So you'd like to be even however you do it. Okay, so now I'm ready to glue these up and turn them in. So if I turn in like this, first, there's going to be some excess here, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is make a cut about 45 degrees, and you can measure this, you can mark this, you can do this in a number of ways, but about 2 board thicknesses away from this corner here, so this is the board that I'm talking about, so about 2 of these thicknesses away from this corner, I'm going to make a 45-degree angle or thereabouts. Doesn't need to be exact, but you want it to be even with all the others. So about 2 board thicknesses will be, I think, right about there. So I'm going to make my cut right there. Now using a scalpel at first will give you better cuts and more even cuts, and measuring them too. But with a little experience, using scissors will go a lot faster. So this is good. So what I have here now is less material. It's not going to bulk up at the corner. And when I paste this side out, I'm going to just press down there and do that. And that turns out to be a nice sharp edge, a nice sharp turn in. Okay. So when I glue up, you always glue up your head and tail before you glue up your foredges. So I'm going to do this edge first, then this edge, and then, this one, then that one. Some people glue out all the edges and then do it, but I'm going to do one at a time. Working on the edge of a table, you'll find might be easier for you. It works for me. And if you have a cloth, such as this, basically any cloth you use can get burnished if you have a bone folder that's actually made of bone. So keep in mind when you're going to bone down cloth, you'd like to use a Teflon bone folder, or you can use your original bone folder, but it should be interleaved by some waste paper. So what's first important to me is this edge. So I'm pushing up the cloth to the edge of the board. I'm using my palm. That works well. You can also use your bone folder. I'm not pressing too hard yet. I just want it to go over evenly. Okay, so that went over. Now I'm going to do the turn-ins like I showed earlier. So there's still some glue here in this corner. So what I want to do is press it down. And then later, when we do the foredge, I'll put that over. But I want to do the turn-ins for these now. And you can see here, depending on how porous your cloth is, some glue might seep out. So understanding your materials and getting comfortable with them is very important. You'll know how everything reacts, and you won't be shocked by anything. You'll basically know how to make the best repair that you can do. So I did those turn-ins. I'm going to do the other side now. When you do this, be very careful that if some PVA seeps out, like it did a little bit there, you don't want it to get on your bone folder, or if it does, you need to wipe your bone folder off immediately, or else you're going to spread that glue all around your cloth. That's not going to look very good. So now the foredges. This is important to keep in mind again, that you do the head and tail first, and then the foredges. The reason that I was taught to do that was the way books are shelved. It has to do with the way books are shelved. Since they're usually shelved on their bottom, it's the bottom edge that's most important. It's most important that that bottom edge is flat. And when you make the turn-in on this foredge last, the bottom is flat, but the foredge isn't. So whenever you make a turn-in, you're going to have a little bit of a bump of the cloth, right? And so you want the bump to be on that foredge, not on the bottom or top. And finally, the last edge. And so what we have is a new case. You might say that one might be faster than the other, depending on your material, depending on what you're working with. If you're working with a book with very, very shabby covers, ones that are frayed at the edges, frayed at the corners, and are not going to work with bad cloth or anything like that, then making a new cover is an investment that you should do. However, with covers in good shape or pretty decent shape that can last for a long time, there's really no problem reusing them. If you have the time, while you're at it, it's best to probably make a new case. But if it's important to you and it does take less material and probably less time, you can reuse this case. What we'll do is case it in as normal, and we have this one here, which is going to fit very nicely for this book. We're only going to do one example because it's the same procedure, really. And we're going to do this one. But keep in mind that you have two options when you come to recasing a book, to use the original or to use a new one. So I felt it was important that you guys know how to make a case. So to case this book in, I don't know if you're going to have bookbinding experience or not, but it's pretty normal to a normal case binding. You're going to want to miter the edges up to the base of the shoulder to kind of reduce the bulk at the bulk that all this material added onto each other might add. So 45 degrees is fine. Again, the goal is just to minimize the bulk at this section here when you eventually paste it down. So I'm going to miter the edges. I'm going to trim the paste down just about 1 millimeter or so because it's going to expand when I glue it out. So I'm going to trim it just on a board. And I like to use my eye on this, but using your dividers would be fine also, or making a mark also. You want this just about 1 millimeter, like I said. Although this might be a little more. Now again, this was just for the paste down, or the page that is going to be pasted back into the covers. And I want to do it on both sides. So now we're ready to go and recase this. It fits well. I want to make sure, and this is not a small point, but you want to make sure that your book is right side up. If you do this very often, it is very likely, although I've never done it yet, to put your book in upside down, and in which case you'll have to redo all the work. So this fits well. I like it. I'm just lining it up so that it's even at the head and tail squares, even at the foredge, and tight. So it doesn't matter which way you start to case in, but or which side you choose to do first, front or back. But what is going to happen is this is the way I lined it up right now is the way I want to case it in. So I'm going to keep this tight, put some pressure here so nothing really moves, then open up the case. We're definitely going to want to use some waste paper to protect the rest of our text block, and after I paste out, you'll see we'll take this out also. So I'm going to use PVA. PVA or PVA mixes are pretty common. You want a brush that's not too big, in which you're going to have huge streaks of glue, but not too small where you're going to be gluing forever. And this size here is somewhat appropriate. So what's key when you're casing in is you want to minimize the amount of how much the book is going to move, or how much the text block is going to move during the whole process. So you want to keep it straight. Once you set how you want the case to fit, you want it to not move at all. So I'm going to put some pressure here the whole time, and then when I flip it, you'll see I'll be giving it some pressure all around as well. I'm going to glue from the bottom of the shoulder out. So you see there's about a 2 millimeter, no, less than that, probably about a 1 millimeter space where I'm not gluing. And I won't glue, actually, I won't be gluing after I put the textile lining down. So I'll just put that down. And then here, I'll leave a little bit at the spine. Now I'm moving pretty slowly, and you'll see that that's not going to turn out too well because this paper is going to curl up very much, and it's going to get somewhat hard to work with. Anytime you introduce moisture to paper, or to cloth, or even to board or anything, anything's made up of wood or rag fibers is going to, or textile or anything, is going to accept the moisture and deform a little bit, expand basically. And you'll see how this is already curling up. That's the moisture that's expanding the paper. So now I'm going to take out the newsprint, and I want everything to stay as it is when I put this cover down. So I'm putting a significant amount of pressure on the spine when I lift this up. I'm pushing down right now, pushing this into the shoulder. And what I want to do is just let that drop. And that's that. I want to work quick so I can do the other side. And I will. Again, I'm being very careful to keep everything lined up how I liked it, how I originally did. And actually this looks pretty well, the way it came back down. That first side at least. So some pressure there, and I'm going to do the same thing. As you might guess, I'm going to put this into the press after. And I'm going to put this in the press for about 5 minutes to really make sure that the glue has spread out evenly and the bond is pretty good. So I'm going to put this into the press, but to protect the text block from any deformations or anything, I'm going to put some Remay and some wax paper. I guess I typically use 20-point cardstock as guards more typically, but the goal is just to prevent any offset of material penetrating your other pages. So this should work here, but like I said, you can use other materials such as cardstock. Okay, so I need these wooden boards again, and I'm just going to wrap this in some newsprint to keep it somewhat clean, and I'm going to put it in the press. So I'm going to put this into the press. And again, the goal is that the glue adheres evenly across everything. You don't really need to work it too hard. And what I'm doing now is just centering it under the screw and the platen. And that looks pretty good. And I'm pressing down somewhat hard, but it's certainly not as hard as it can go. Because if you press down too hard, especially when you're doing it with a new case, you have the chance to tear your cloth at where your spine at the top of your shoulder, where your spine is. So I'm going to put this in for a few minutes, actually, probably about 2, just to make sure that the glue is getting spread out pretty evenly. And after I take it out, I'm just going to re-emphasize the groove, the groove of the shoulder, with my bone folder, and set it aside for another day, and then after the end of the day it's ready to go back into circulation. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a little kind of squeak or crinkle of the glue as you lift off the platen and put it down. I sometimes like to give varying amounts of pressure going up and down just to try and work those out a little bit. But that's a personal thing. So I took this out of the press. And you want this to rest as is under a light weight for about 24 hours. And then after that, it should be good to go. You do want to, though, set the joint, as with any book you recase, or any cased, or any book that you make that you case in. And the way you do that, which you should do again after it rests for 24 hours, is hold down a bit, or put some pressure at the spine and on the book, and just basically push down the board. I'm pushing pressure this way on the board, this way, so that it's kind of getting pushed into the shoulder, and that's called setting the joint. And you want to do that on both sides. And before we go, let me just show you how it turned out. So I set the joints there. And what you have is a brand new book. Or rather, the same book given a brand new life for your circulating collection.